changing the title at the last moment, so it's not on the program. But as I was researching this paper, I was reading some Chinese sources, and it occurred to me that in Chinese, we have kind of the opposite terminology as in English. So in English, we have the difference between food safety and food security. In Chinese, when you talk about food safety, safety and security are the same word, but the word for food supply and food product is different. And so that got me thinking about the relationship between food safety and food security. So what I'm going to do in this paper is talk about how China's economic rise has affected our understanding of food security and food safety, and what are the changing human security implications of this. And I've been working on food safety issues for a couple of years now. I first started this project when I was in Hong Kong in 2008, which coincided, when I stayed there, coincided with the melamine crisis in milk. So we had an observation approach to see how the issue of food safety resonated in Hong Kong in particular and in the region more broadly. And it was a very interesting time to study that issue because it was at the same moment that we were all worried about Chinese milk. This was the time that the Chinese spacewalk occurred. So you had, on the one hand, this example of Chinese technology and know-how in terms of creating the spacesuits and the successful spacewalk. At the same other time, people were not confident that China was producing safe milk. So how is it possible that China has these incredible achievements at the same time as it has this milk crisis? And I think what it does is it reveals that there are many sides to China. If we focus on China's rise, we miss some of the inequality that still persists in China. And that this inequality is not just a problem for Chinese people, it's a problem for all of us because our food products come from rural China. And because of China's involvement as a global player in the food chain, this has real implications for all of us in terms of food safety. And so I'm going to look at these international implications, in particular for the United States and Japan. And I picked these two countries because I live in the United States, and there's been a lot of attention placed on food safety scandals with China, and Japan also has had a series of food safety scandals among Chinese products. So the discussion of food security and food safety has really changed an incredible amount in the past 15 years. This book, you might remember it, by Lester Brown, 1995, Who Will Feed China? He was raising alarm bells about the availability of arable land in China. Would it be sufficient by 2030? Would China have to import massive amounts of grain if it was not sufficient, and what would that do to world prices? And so this book really was very controversial, both inside China and outside China. And there were criticisms of this book by Václav Smil, for example. It's stated that Lester Brown underestimated the amount of arable land in China, partly because Chinese statistics were not very reliable. There was a lot of underreporting of the available land in China for various reasons, to avoid taxes or to avoid mandatory grain transfers to the state. But that, as Smil pointed out, since we have remote sensing data and other data, we can have a better picture, and it's not so bleak as Brown pointed out. But now the conversation has shifted. We're no longer as concerned about the supply of food in China. China has made a lot of progress in terms of its grain stores. Now what we're worried about, the conversation has shifted to what is in the Chinese food products. What are they feeding us? And there have been a whole series of food safety scandals. This isn't even a complete list. These are just the ones that really have made the headlines in the United States and Japan. Counterfeit baby formula, the pet food issue, and all of these have led to deaths, I should say, not just injuries. And heparin at the end, that's a blood-thinning drug that's made from pig intestines, which is why it makes it onto this list. And so the conversation has really changed in just a short space of years. So how do we define food security and food safety? I went back to the Food and Agriculture Organization to see how are these two related. Normally when we think of food security, we're thinking about avoiding hunger, thinking of the availability of food, and possibly its protection from tampering, either intentional or biosecurity in terms of terrorists attacking a food store. But the Food and Agriculture Organization has combined food safety with food security. First, by setting up this Codex Alimentaris Commission, which defines best practices in food safety, how different products should be handled. In one of its earlier statements in 1974, it talked about the availability of adequate food. So by adequate, we can assume that means safe to eat. But it was really in 1996 with the Rome Declaration that the FAO talked about the right to safe and nutritious food, adequate food, and freedom from hunger. So food safety became a part of the discussion at that moment. And then later, last year, we heard commitment to food safety. So going back to the discussion this morning, where does this fit in terms of human security? The Human Development Report, as President Tedeschi mentioned this morning, includes food security as one of its items. But usually when we're talking about food security, we're not talking about food safety. Usually we're just talking about the issue of hunger. And if we look at definitions of human security, for example, Astrid Circa's definition looks at human security as one of extreme vulnerability. And so in this paper, I was asking myself, who is vulnerable in cases of food security and food safety? And normally we think of the poor, the poorest citizens, the poorest countries are the most vulnerable in these instances. But I also found that because of globalization of the food supply chain, that we are all vulnerable. It's not just there are, of course, in particular, poor people suffer from these problems, but we are all vulnerable because of the globalized economy. And so in the paper, I first looked at China and food security and how China has changed from a recipient of food aid to a donor of food aid, and how its land use has affected its food supply. So interestingly, when we first talked about food security in China, we were trying to address the problem of hunger. And China received from 1979 to 2005 $1 billion in food aid from the World Food Program alone. But food aid stopped in 2005 when China became the third largest donor of food aid. So China became, in the space of 3 decades, a food donor. It was a very major shift in China's position. And so as I mentioned with the Lester Brown book, the initial concern was, did China have enough arable land to produce food to feed its population? Some of the statistics seem to give an impression that China was not in possession of adequate land. But the question that, as I said, that was not an accurate picture. But still, there are a lot of human security problems related to food security in China. And one of the most important ones has to do with equal access to food. And there I bring in the issue of rural-urban differences. So we talk about the rise of China, but not all of China is rising economically at the same pace. And there's still a considerable amount of poverty. The statistics vary from 10% of Chinese people living below $1 a day or slightly more than that. But nonetheless, that's a significant amount of people. And not only do they have fewer resources with which to buy food, but they have unequal access to different types of food. So urban and rural residents have a different diet, for example, with rural residents relying more on grain products and urban residents having a more diverse diet, including more different protein sources. And this is important because as Chinese people begin to consume more meat, as urban people consume more meat, this will affect China's ability to produce enough food, because a kilogram of beef requires 10 times the amount of water than a kilogram of wheat. And so if we're talking a lot about water scarcity in China, the changing diets, and particularly in urban areas, will have an impact on this. China already has only 12% of its land suitable for cultivation, and many of these areas are prone to droughts. And 75% of agricultural land in China needs to be irrigated. And so if you put additional pressure on this in the form of meat, cattle raising, then this will further cause further problems. And then there are, of course, many other additional environmental problems. I didn't get to go into detail in the paper yet, but I realized I revise it, including water pollution, pollution of existing water supplies, and pesticide use, which contaminates food products and causes difficulties in terms of food products that are imported by other countries. Another problem has to do with biofuels. We were talking about energy security earlier. Biofuel production would also impact the availability of agricultural land. And by one account, to meet the biofuel target for the 11th five-year plan, China would need to use 5 to 10% of its arable land for this purpose. And so that would further restrict the amount available for agriculture. And so this is why China has been looking to purchase land in other countries so that they could use land in other countries for biofuels and keep grain production inside of China. So what does this mean for the rest of the world? China's a big player now in terms of importing food and also purchasing land for agricultural use overseas. And so what China does has important repercussions. So when there was a big price rise a couple of years ago in world food prices, China restricted its exports of food to make sure that prices didn't go up too much internally, because that could be a very big source of instability at home. But then that was difficult for low-income countries who were dependent on those exports. China, as I mentioned, has been purchasing land in other countries for biofuels and other industrial crops. And there was a report about a Chinese company's interest in purchasing the Canadian potash firm. That's been very much in the news here in connection with the Australian bid. But there was speculation, what if there were a Chinese bid? What would that do to confidence about availability of fertilizer in North America? Because that company produces half the fertilizer sold in North America. So if a Chinese company owned that firm, that would raise alarm bells in the importers. In terms of the United States and Japan, for the United States, China's position as a net global food importer beginning in 2008 was an opportunity in terms of sales of soybeans and other crops. Global agribusinesses have been rushing to make investments there. But potentially this could cause competition for food importing countries like Japan, for example, who are also looking for farmland and imports outside of their country. Japan, for example, has relatively low food self-sufficiency. Depends on imports for 70% of its cereals, for 60% of its fruit and 50% of its meat and 40% of its vegetables. And much of the fruit and vegetables comes from China. And so, so there are different competitive pressures that result from China's demands on the food markets. Okay, the next part of the paper looks at food safety in China and what are its implications. First, I look at food safety inside China, and I found that there are also rural-urban differences in terms of access to safe food, not only access to food itself, but safe food. And rural areas have become a kind of dumping ground for poor quality products, cheaper products. And this was revealed in the 2004 scandal with milk formula in Anhui province, central China, a very poor province, where several babies died from this formula, which had no nutritional value at all. They developed a condition called big head syndrome, and they died. And so partly it's because of low income levels. The rural people are receptive to these products. Partly they don't have the opportunity to make other choices, but also because rural areas in China are left really in a regulatory vacuum in terms of food safety. That although a lot of food is produced in rural areas, actually the regulation does not take place there, it takes place in towns. And so this becomes an issue because of the decentralization of the Chinese food industry. There are more than 400,000 Chinese companies involved in food production in China, and that's compared to 150,000 in the United States. So we have a very decentralized food industry, a lot of it taking place in rural areas. For example, in the dairy industry, which I've been looking at, more than half of the dairy producers are small family farms, and 80% of those only have 1 to 5 cows. And so it's obviously not possible for the Chinese government to inspect every cow, but they don't make it easy for rural people to have cost-effective access to regulatory resources. And also, China doesn't have what's called a farm-to-table approach to regulation. Food safety regulation in China focuses on the final product, not on the process and the food chain. So there are big gaps in the food safety system, as we saw with the 2008 melamine crisis, where it was middlemen who were buying milk from farmers to sell to 22 big companies who were lacing the milk with melamine to mask its low protein content, because they diluted it to get more money from their product, and then they put in this melamine, which is like a plastic compound, but one that gives a reading that seems like protein because it has nitrogen in it, which protein does. And so these middlemen were not part of the regulation framework. So what about the rest of us? We are vulnerable because China is a big source of food ingredients. China doesn't just sell finished goods or produce or seafood, they also sell ingredients that are put in processed food. And so these are diagrams about the different countries that contributed products to your multi-grain bar. You can go to the supermarket and buy a multi-grain bar, probably no one is going to do this anymore. There are these 8 countries that have contributed ingredients. And even the food processors themselves don't always know where the ingredient came from for each batch of food that's produced. So it's incredibly difficult to track. And so when there was the melamine crisis, although the United States doesn't import Chinese milk, we do have certain dairy products that are found in power bars and non-dairy creamer and things like that. And it's very impossible to know if there was a Chinese milk product in that good, because by United States law, you're not required to list country of origin for milk products, only for seafood, vegetables, and certain other, a very small list of items. And so because the global food chain is like this, you have a lot of outsourcing of ingredients. And so our high-priced drugs have ingredients from a family farm in China. And you don't know it's from Mr. Wang's farm, even their blood thinning drug. You have no idea. So because of a lack of transparency in the process, there's a vulnerability, a general vulnerability for all of us. So what are the implications? China has been trying to do something about its food safety matters. It's bad for the China brand, bad for China's reputation. They've taken a variety of steps, new laws, new commissions, new efforts, but there are a lot of constraints due to the nature of the Chinese state, government-business relations, limits on participation of social groups in monitoring, and also limits on the role of information. And I've covered this in another paper. But even the Chinese Minister of Health acknowledges that China's food safety situations remains grim. And this was after the passage of the new food safety law. In terms of the U.S. and Japan, the U.S. has taken a more bilateral approach to this problem, negotiating an agreement with China in 2007, subsequently agreeing with China to have more food safety monitors in each other's countries. But from a U.S. perspective, it's also up to the United States government to do more to protect American consumers. And at the moment, only 1% of imported food is inspected in the United States. And there is a new food safety law that's making its way through Congress and hopefully will be approved. In Japan, they take a more proactive role because of some scandals that happened in the last decade over imports of Chinese products like spinach and frozen dumplings. Japan has much more strict standards of inspection. They inspect about 10 times more food than the United States does. They also have technical aid to China that works at the plant inside China to make sure that the food is at the adequate standard. Japan being more dependent in some ways on imports from China has really taken care to make sure that these products are safe by creating barriers inside Japan and working on the ground inside China. And so I'll just conclude that there are many different types of vulnerabilities that are involved in understanding food security and food safety inside China. You know, traditionally we've been more concerned with, in terms of food security with the very poor, dealing with hunger. But I think because of the globalized economy and China's role in it, we have to expand this definition and look at the vulnerability of the supply chain. And also, you know, despite our attention to the rise of China, to keep in mind that there are very many inequalities inside China that still raise a lot of food security and food safety problems. So I'll stop here. Thank you.